All right. Hi, everyone. We're gonna go ahead and get started. Thanks everybody for joining us today for this session. We're gonna go through three separate presentations, and then at the end of those, we'll have a 30-minute slot for discussion. If throughout the presentations, if you have any questions or comments, please use the chat feature, and we may answer asynchronously via the chat or pick up on your question in the discussion towards the end. So our first presentation is going to come from our friends at Duolingo. Joseph, you want to get started?
Hello, everybody. I'm Xiangying Zhang. My colleague Joseph and I are going to share with you the work we do on the team of learning assessment at Duolingo. First, just a little brief intro about Duolingo. Duolingo is a language teaching platform. It was launched in 2012, and we have more than 300 million learners globally. Currently, we offer more than 90 courses, and all our learning content is free. The mission of Duolingo is to develop the best education in the world and make it universally available. The goal of the learning assessment team is to evaluate Duolingo's efficacy, so we can build more effective product, and we can also show the world that Duolingo is an effective way to learn a language. For this presentation, I'm going to introduce the course structure a little bit, and then Joseph will share with you the approach of in-app assessment. And then finally, we will address some of the limitations of in-app assessment. So for our Duolingo course, it's structured like a tree. Each circle represents a unit. And there are rows of units. Some rows have 1 unit, some rows have 2 or 3 units. So these rows of units are designed to teach specific vocabulary and grammatical concepts around communicative functions. So for example, one of these circles says food, one of this says family. These are communicative functions, what learners are learning to be able to talk about. So the earlier units focus on language basics. So as users progress through the course, units build on each other and introduce harder material. For example, later on, we will have food unit 2, food unit 3, 4, 5. They are not next to each other, but instead they are scattered throughout the course. Units consist of a set of lessons. Users can level up a unit by completing all its lessons. As users level up a unit, the exercises shown get harder and require more integration and production. And users must level up all units in a row at least once to unlock the next row. So as a side note, not all users go through a course in the same way. Users have the choice of when and whether they level up units. So this non-linear course structure is actually a big challenge for assessing effectiveness. In addition to the course content, Duolingo also offers Duolingo stories, Duolingo podcasts, audio lessons, and we are constantly developing new features. Next, Joseph.
Oh dear, technical issues. Let's see if we can fix that. Okay, thank you all. Thanks, Xiangying. So now I'm going to talk just briefly about our current approach to in-app assessment. This is something that we're always thinking about improving, so this is a current idea. I'm going to break that down into 4 different sections. First, we're going to talk a little bit about Duolingo's data-driven culture and how effectiveness plays in there. Next, we're going to talk about one of the core features that we use, which we call the checkpoint quiz. Then we're going to talk a little bit about how we use the checkpoint quiz with other types of log data to provide more interesting insights. Finally, we're going to talk about something new that we've been playing around with recently, which we're not 100% sure on yet, but we're really excited about. All right, so data-driven culture. Now, what a good buzzword. So at Duolingo, we really prescribe to this idea of a data-driven culture. And what that means for us is that all product changes, regardless of how large they are or small, are tested using A/B tests. So half of our users see the new feature, whatever it may be, and half of our users don't. And we see what kind of an effect that feature has. We also measure both company and team success using a set of core metrics that we really, really care about. And so the question that's been, at the top of our mind for a really long time as a mission-driven company, the main thing that we care about is developing the best education in the world and providing it to people, is where does learning efficacy fit into a data-driven company culture? And I think the reason why this is an interesting question for us is that there are two primary challenges with measuring efficacy in this framework. First, learning is a latent trait. So unlike engagement or revenue, which are the kinds of things that we are used to measuring, learning cannot be measured directly. We always have to have some method through which we are measuring learning. And secondly, in our experience, learning just takes a long time for us to measure. Frequently too long for the kinds of iterative A/B testing that we would like to be doing. And so with these two challenges in mind, we've come up with an approach or a solution that we currently have found quite successful. And our solution is the following. First, we augment the in-app experience to make it easier for us to measure learning. So we make changes to the product, not to make it better, not to add teaching, not to make it more engaging, but simply so that we can make measuring learning easier. We then develop easy to use heuristics that we find correlate with better learning outcomes, and then use these heuristics to measure the effect of changes on learning outcomes. So these three stages have been extremely influential for our success at measuring learning outcomes. So now let's talk through an example of how this looks in practice. So we'll talk a little bit about the checkpoint quiz. One thing that we haven't yet talked about in terms of Duolingo's structure or course structure is that each course is broken into sections. So you have section 1, section 2, section 3. And between each of these sections is what we call a checkpoint. And in order to progress past a checkpoint, users must complete a checkpoint quiz. Now, one of the things that Xiangying mentioned earlier on is that one of our main challenges is the fact that people can use the app in a ton of different ways, right? They can level up all their skills to the max. They can just go through the content once. They can practice as much as they want. There's a lot of freedom in the user experience. And one of the things that checkpoints provide us is a point at which all users have to funnel through. So they have become a really great opportunity for us to test how much users have learned in the previous section. The items in the checkpoint quiz are designed by curriculum experts to test what we think are the important concepts taught in that section. And you can see two examples on the right-hand side of the screen. There is a large pool of items, much larger than the test itself, covering vocabulary, grammar, reading, listening, and even pre-response writing. Now, one of the most important things for the checkpoint quiz design is something that we call our pre-test, post-test design. I'm going to try to explain it with this visualization, so bear with me. The basic idea here is you have a user who's progressing through Duolingo. And first, they're completing section 1, and then they're seeing checkpoint quiz 1, and then they're doing section 2, and then they're completing quiz 2, section 3, quiz 3. And so the question is, well, what do these quizzes look like in between these sections? And so, unsurprisingly, in quiz 1, we have a bunch of questions or items that test the previous section. But another thing that we do is we put some items that test the next section of the course. And the idea here is that it gives us an idea of what people knew before they entered this section of the course. We then show exactly the same items in a post-test in quiz 2. And this format continues. So we then have a section 3 pre-test, which becomes a section 3 post-test, and so on and so forth. And so this pre-test and post-test design gives us a really nice structure for measuring changes. And I'll explain why in a little bit. Now, just a quick side note, and I think this is really important. So the checkpoint quiz, the entire feature was added to make it easier for us to measure effectiveness. We didn't add this feature to improve learning outcomes or engagement directly. Instead, the primary goal of this feature is to make it easier for us to measure the effectiveness of the platform. And that is crucial, I think, to this feature. So you may be asking, all right, well, that looks lovely, but what can you do with it? And there are 3 things that we found quite successful. One is, since we have this rich set of items which are tagged with grammatical concepts and the like, we can quite easily investigate specific grammatical concepts. We can ought to see whether we're teaching them well or not. Or maybe people just know them before they start and we don't need to teach them. Another thing that we found useful is it allows us to measure learning across sections of a course. So we can see, are people remembering the content from earlier sections? Are they combining it with the knowledge they have, or are they struggling as they progress further through the tree? And then finally, it allows us to compare outcomes of different courses, given that we can trust that the population of users is similar and the item pools are similar. But now things get interesting because, you know, the main point of this talk is talking about log data. We haven't really done that yet, so we better have. So we're going to talk a little bit about how we use the checkpoint quiz with the log data that we collect. So you can imagine, in a sense, that the pre-test and post-test for a section act as bookends for a user's experience on the platform, or a section of time that they're using the platform. And so what we can do is we can look at all of the activity that a user does between the pre-test and the post-test. So for example, maybe we call these pieces of activity sessions. And so they complete session 1, session 2, session 3. And due to the ability for users to pick their own path through the app, we don't necessarily know in advance what that path is going to be for each user. But we do know that we have a log of these sessions. We can then combine these sessions together into a set of features that represent the user's progress. So for example, one really basic feature would be just the number of sessions that they've completed. But we can get as fine-grained as we want, right? So we could look at specific items, we can look at specific sessions, we can get as fine-grained as we want, but we generally convert the sessions into a set of features. These features can then be fed into a statistical model. And of course, the main question now is, well, what is this statistical model predicting? And the thing that we tend to predict is gain. And by gain, we mean the change in scores between the post-test and the pre-test. And so this statistical model now allows us to see which of these session features correlate well with gain, which we can then use to develop heuristics. So to show this in writing, it looks a little bit like this. We're going to aggregate the sessions completed by users between the checkpoint quiz, pre-test and post-test. We're then going to build statistical models predicting gain using features built from session data. We're then going to find user behaviors from those features that correlate with better learning outcomes, and finally develop heuristic metrics that measure found user behaviors. All right, so I'm going to finish off by talking about a new thing that we're currently testing, which I'm kind of excited about, which is review challenges. And the motivation behind review challenges is that we wanted a tool that gave us learning data faster with fewer resources. So the checkpoint quiz, right? Checkpoints aren't a common occurrence for a given user. And it's very expensive to create all of these items in terms of time and other stuff. So we wanted to try something a little bit different. And the general structure that we hit upon is this idea that we inject challenges into lessons that have been randomly sampled from an earlier unit. And to try to visualize that a little bit, because I know it's a little complicated, is suppose you have a user who's got a tree that looks, or a course like this, and they're currently doing lessons in the family skill. What we do is we inject an item from an earlier skill into this later skill, and then look at how the user did on this injected item. And we call this a review because it's an item that the user has seen before. And you may be thinking, well, yes, that's lovely. But what that allows us to do is, in the same way with the checkpoint quiz, we had those two bookends. We now have these two bookends where we have the time where the user was first introduced to this lesson and the time when they saw a review challenge. And we can look at all of the sessions and activity and log data that they did in between those two. And you know the drill. We aggregate these into session features. We create a model, and we make predictions. Now, for sake of simplicity here, we're focusing primarily on the scores of the review item, but you can get as fancy as you want. And so we've managed to make another approach which is quite similar, that has some different properties. To give you an idea of the similarities and differences between the checkpoint quiz and review challenges, they both kind of fit a different niche, in that the checkpoint quiz takes a little longer to collect data. It's a lot more expensive for us to create because we have to make all of these items. However, it's also tagged by experts. All of these items are heavily tagged and looked at to make sure that they're measuring exactly what we care about. The content for the checkpoint quiz is siloed. So we're not using that content in the course at all, which means that there's a little bit more validity. But with the checkpoint quiz, we can only really show it in certain courses. And so you can see that these two features have a very similar structure, but fit different niches. So at this point, I'm going to hand it over to Xiangying, who's going to talk a little bit about some of the limitations of this approach and the ways that we've dealt with them.
Thank you, Joseph. Yeah, we do see some limitations with in-app assessment. For example, we cannot really align the findings to external standards. This gives us achievement information, but nothing about proficiency. And the results are all very context dependent. And we cannot generalize it outside Duolingo. So one solution to this problem is to conduct external assessments, so using tools outside the app to measure the effectiveness of Duolingo. So for example, we've been conducting user studies. So a series of studies we have done, we recruited Duolingo users at a specific point in experience to complete proficiency tests offered by external agencies. So to compare with the two in-app assessment features, so we're thinking user studies, it's a lot slower for data collection, and it takes a lot more control, and it's expensive. But the strength is these measurements we use are externally validated, and the results can be interpreted by external parties. So these are the three approaches we use, in-app and also external. But now to conclude, we think maintaining a portfolio of approaches is crucial. So we look at the in-app assessment, meanwhile complement it with external proficiency tests. We also think that it's useful to have heuristics when metrics move too slowly for A/B testing. And having clear start and end points can simplify our analysis. For example, the use of pre, post, so we can take into consideration learners' prior knowledge when they started to use Duolingo. So this will be the end of our presentation. So please post questions on chat or hold them on till later. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks so much. All right, next up is Khan Academy. So I'm gonna get the slides up here in a moment. While those come up, I'm Kelly Hill and I head up our efficacy and research team at Khan Academy. And today with me as my co-presenters are Cody Weatherholt, Kat Hicks, and Phil Grimaldi. Will be passing back and forth throughout the presentation. So what we're gonna focus on is, is there a little bit of a lag here?
The screen, are the slides available?
Yeah, the slides are showing, but they haven't advanced yet. Thank you, there we go. So I'm gonna start off by talking about our vision for efficacy and research at Khan Academy. And then I'm gonna turn it over to Kat, and she's gonna talk about learning behaviors that we measure via log data. And then Cody's gonna talk through a couple of examples, and then Phil's gonna close us out and talk about what we're gonna be up to next. So before I dive into the vision, for those of you who haven't kept tabs on Khan Academy or aren't familiar with us, we are a nonprofit with a mission to provide a free world-class education for anyone, anywhere. These stats on this slide are pre-COVID. They're much higher now. Now we're up to 100 million registered users, but before COVID, 70 million registered users with 18 million learners per month across 190 countries, and were translated into 40 languages. And Khan Academy has evolved a lot since 2007, when it was primarily Sal Khan in his closet making videos about various math topics for independent learners on YouTube. Since then, we've evolved into a mastery-based personalized learning system that's used both by independent learners as well as students in classrooms. We have a total of 429 courses with over 17,000 videos, 4,000 articles, and 75,000 practice exercises. So we've come a long way since 2007. And in 2017, that's when our efficacy and research function was created. So we're a really new function at Khan Academy, and our research agenda is structured to understand three really broad questions. We first look, we start off by looking at how time on Khan Academy is associated with achievement. And we have a growing body of evidence from our own studies and also from independent research, which predates our current efficacy team. And all that's posted on our impact page. You can see the link is on the slide there. But what we're gonna focus on today is really this next part, under what conditions. So what we're learning from our time-focused analyses is that how you spend your time on Khan Academy really matters. And our plans are to further expand this work, and we're gonna be talking about more of that with you today. And then finally, we want to understand for whom. So we wanna understand, when students are spending their time on Khan Academy or when they're using it in certain ways, we always consider for whom to ensure that all learners are benefiting from using Khan Academy. And so while we have big data on our products, our data alone is insufficient to answer these questions. And so we have a variety of research partnerships established where our partners are able to provide us with the demographic information that we need, and also with test score data from external assessments. And so with these data sharing agreements, we're able to link our usage data to a subset of users' demographics and achievement data. And so where we start with all of this in defining these under what conditions and for whom is this is what you see right here is a very high level theory of action. We have very detailed versions by product, but we develop these based on the product's intent and what we know is effective to get a roadmap of what do we think are the best conditions under which our products should be used. we call these best practices. So now I'm going to turn it over to Kat, who's going to talk more about how we use log data to measure different types of learning behaviors.
Thank you, Kelly. I'm just going to talk a little bit about what we mean by this idea of learning engineering. So our team thinks about questions like, how are we going to get into this log data as learning scientists and look at it from a position that brings together the learning science, but also understands the engineering context of a digital platform. So like all of our friends on this panel, probably Khan Academy has a lot of data, but we're still building out this cycle and trying to develop this model. An example that I really like to use is the concept of a trace measure. So a traditional trace measure is some physical trace that's left from the past behavior that happens in an environment. I liken this to what we're doing with our log data because we're trying to look at that real life learner behavior and see it in an environment that we built. And an example that I really like to talk about is this old staircase. So you can imagine that you're in an old building and you're looking at this staircase and you might take away some engineering insights from what you see here. You can see that it's built to transport you up in space, that there's constraints about fitting it into the hallway, but there's also a way that people's behaviors have interacted with and changed the environment. So there's the predictable way that the steps have been worn down. And I like this example because I think that it helps to think about how we observe proxies, for behavioral patterns in the kind of data we're looking at. It's not just interesting because of engineering constraint insights like, do we need to reinforce the steps in this way, but insight into what people might need. So things like, could we build a broader staircase, or people tend to congregate in one part of the step. So it's also important to think about how these patterns can show up in really counterintuitive ways. This is really key, I think, in massive amounts of log data, where we can have big data and big patterns that give us power, but sometimes mask really important differences. So for example, you could come in with expectations for how a student will move through material, but those expectations could be subverted if you tie your observation back to learning science. So for instance, you could see people spend a lot of time on a question that we had labeled as a really easy question, but because they spent a lot of time on it, we dig in deeper, we realize it was actually consistently misunderstood by students. So I think that we try to take a bottom-up and a top-down perspective, which is another thing that learning engineering is really about, fitting into the middle of that, working with the built environment, getting interpretations from learning science, and constantly checking our assumptions against the real life data to look at these relationships that emerge. So now I'm going to turn it over to Cody, who will talk through some examples of how we take this approach in our work.
Yeah, hi all, I'm Cody. I'm going to go through two kind of data viz centric examples. The first one is focusing just on time and the ways that we might be able to detect trace measures when dealing just with time. So this graph is kind of what we're going to unpack a bit. But one of the things that we know from the outset is that learning is multidimensional. It's not just showing up and spending time. It's how you spend the time. What are the activities and the processes that occur over time that result in learning? But also the product and the platform experience is multidimensional. There are lots of ways of engaging. And so one of the questions then naturally is, even if we take something seemingly simple like time, how do we understand time in multiple dimensions? And this graph here is kind of one attempt to do that. So we could step through, one of the things we can see over here in this far left column is that in this particular study, we had recommended to students that they spend 30 minutes a week. And one of the things we might ask right away is just kind of what percentage of this sample hit the recommended threshold, and what percentage of the sample kind of used for varying amounts. And so right away, we can kind of see a breakdown of, some of the students registered, 49% down there on the bottom, they registered, but they didn't actually end up using. And so we see kind of drop off in the funnel in that way. And we see that 7% kind of hit this 30-minute a week mark. But then we might start to wonder, okay, well, so students are individual actors, and they've kind of, here we can kind of see this unidimensional view of in total, what was their dosage? But we might start to ask questions about, well, how did students cluster by class? And so we can start to look at this kind of intersection. And one of the things that we see emerging already at this level is that students who hit a certain dosage level tend to be clustering together in classes that are using on average about the same amount. And so that influences our reasoning about, okay, so sure, some students might be might be more motivated, might be more engaged, might be using more or less, but there's also this kind of umbrella influence of the class that you're in is then influencing the way that you're interacting. And so then we want to start to think about not just users themselves, but also like what is some of the higher level structure that might be influencing the degree and manner of use. And then we can go even further and start to ask, okay, so we know that there's this kind of clustering by class, but we could ask questions around, well, what is it that students are actually doing if they've hit 30 minutes a week or 15 to 29 minutes a week? What is that overall time composed of? And so we can kind of continue out in this flow diagram, and we can start to see, a large, even though not a lot of students hit the recommended dosage of 30 minutes, we see that across different usage levels, students in this case were engaging with the target course. They were engaging more specifically with what's labeled here as on-task exercises, rather than things like articles or videos or like off-task types of exercises. So not to dwell too much on the specifics but more so this is just a way of, even if we just take one dimension of time, how can we kind of decompose that into relevant moving pieces? But we can also start to imagine going far beyond time. Time can be easy to measure, but that's not really what, it's not just showing up and spending time that's causing learning. So we might want to understand a lot more about the actual behaviors that underlie that. So in a similar vein, I'm going to kind of build up another graph that has a lot of information in it and is able to kind of convey multiple dimensions. So we might start by asking, in this case, these data come from a study that we had done. The students are about 500,000, all of whom were registered users, and we might want to know just a typical kind of funnel analysis of, okay, of this sample of people who registered, how many of them actually kind of made it through the gate and engaged in some level of product use? And we see that in this case, only 45% of this sample actually kind of did anything on the platform. And we see that 10% spent 6 hours and 7% went on and completed a practice exam. So not to dwell too much on the specifics, but one thing we might ask of these data is kind of like, what does the overall funnel look like? And in this case, we see a bit of a steep kind of drop-off funnel, which raises questions in and of itself. But we might then want to go a click layer deeper and start to say, okay, well, what were the various combinations of behaviors that kind of went into that funnel? And this matrix here is an example to kind of visualize various combinations of behaviors that we see in the data. So in particular, we can imagine something like, okay, everything in this row here labeled as 6 hours is classifying an interaction of, the user did 6 hours and didn't engage in a best practice, or the user spent 6 hours and completed a practice exam. So we're kind of able to visualize some intersectionality here. And then we can start to layer in on top of that intersectionality, how frequently were these various combinations of behaviors? And we can see things like, the histogram kind of shows overall frequency, but we can also imagine layering in another dimension of the color coding here. It's kind of then pulling out a grouping structure of within these various combinations of behaviors. The blue here is showing students who spent, less than 6 hours, but kind of engaged in a subset of desired behaviors. And so we can start to get a lot richer information, still kind of in aggregate, but about users' journeys and their behavior choices. And then we can add in an additional layer on top of that. And this ties into where we kind of partner externally to pull in off-platform measures. So we can then say, looking at some of these off-platform score gain or achievement measures, we can start to say, how are these different on-platform behaviors associated with score gains on these off-platform metrics? And what becomes particularly striking in this kind of multi-dimensional view is we can pull out a few examples. Like we'll just drill in here on these 3 columns, but we can see that these students, there are some who spent a similar amount of time overall. All 3 of the students in that kind of striation on average spent about 8.5 hours. But we see that those students engaged in very different behaviors. And they also had kind of very, very different outcomes. And so we can start to kind of triangulate between a lot of pieces of how much time did you spend overall? What was that time composed of? What were the learning outcomes associated with that, that composition of behaviors? And then part of the takeaway from this kind of multidimensional reasoning is that we can see, on the one hand, there's really promising signal of certain behaviors that we might already predict from the learning sciences are associated with quite substantive gains. However, there's also this kind of drop off in the funnel where some of those behaviors that are associated with the largest learning gains are also the least frequent on the platform. So then that leads to questions on more on the engineering side, like how can we design a better experience that facilitates more of these desired behaviors to kind of drive engagement in the funnel in service of driving the downstream outcomes. And from there, I'll turn it over to Phil to kind of talk about where we go from here.
Super. Yeah, so I'm going to take stock on, well, let's take stock for a second on where we're at right now. And that's best exemplified by this figure in the upper left quadrant of the slide here. And through our partners, we're able to gain access to these incredible validated measures of learning. And we can look at a student's performance level at time 1, and then we can look at their performance level at time 2. Combine that with all of the log data that we have on Khan Academy. And like Cody just showed, we can do these high-level, really coarse-grained analyses of all the students' behaviors and how that relates to improvements from time 1 to time 2. In most cases, though, these time frames are quite large. It might be a semester, an entire semester's of work, or even an entire school year of work. And so what we're really doing is we're saying, okay, here's a huge pattern of behaviors that a student engages in, and whether we're making inferences about their learning outcomes. But where we really want to be is down at the bottom lower left quadrant of the screen, and that is where we can look at all these small incremental gains that happen with all of the different actions that a student takes. So they might engage in one small behavior, and that results in a small incremental gain. They might engage in another behavior, and that might result in no gain at all to their learning, and so on and so forth. To do this, though, requires us to do a lot of re-engineering of our existing data structures to make it so that we're able to do that. We also need to really enhance our ability to use our in-product quizzes and practice exams. Fortunately, we have all of these validated external data already, so we can validate against those external quizzes and tests and start to look at moment-to-moment changes in student learning. What I'm really excited about is the ability to do within student comparisons. So a particular student engages in a particular behavior for one topic and a different set of behaviors for another topic, and then comparing the outcome from those two behaviors. And that gives us a much richer view of what's actually driving learning. Cody, go ahead and advance to the next slide. So beyond just these engineering changes and changes to our methods that we're eyeing, we also have a lot of big questions for the future. And top of mind, no surprise, is COVID-19. Khan Academy has been really thrust into this large leadership role amid the COVID-19 crisis. We've seen a huge uptick in usage of our platform, and for the most part, a lot of these users are first-time distance learners. These are students who have been engaged in very structured learning environments for most of their educational careers. And now they're required to do a lot of self-initiated and self-regulated learning. So what does learning look like on this platform, and how is it affecting outcomes? And not all unrelated to that are the issues of economic and opportunity gaps that exist and are being exacerbated by COVID-19. Cody showed examples, pre-COVID, of there being large variability in how students use our platform. And to a certain extent, a large part of that variability is predicted by demographic differences. And those are certainly going to be exacerbated by the COVID-19 crisis. And of course, all of those differences in behaviors can lead to differences in outcomes. So it is very much in our interest as an organization and stewards of the educational community to understand where these opportunity gaps exist. Can we instrument our systems in a way to help close these gaps and design a better system that's going to help all students equally? And that's all. Cody, next slide.
Great, thanks everyone. Our contact info is there if you need to reach out to any of us. And now I'm going to turn it over to Andy at Digital Promise.
So, hi everyone. Thanks for joining all of us this afternoon. This is a ton of fun seeing the participant count increasing throughout the different talks. And I'm going to offer some remarks on a couple of projects that we're tackling at Digital Promise. From the time that we put out this presentation, I've since moved to the University of Michigan. We're doing some of this work there, but I'm still in close collaboration with folks at Digital Promise. And the particular take is a nice combination of what we heard from Duolingo and Khan Academy. We're going to talk about measuring learning behaviors using data from a common learning management system, but in a slightly different setting. This setting was a research practice partnership between folks at Digital Promise and a charter management organization, with the focus of making sense of data that were collected and stored in this learning management system. And so these two organizations got together to try and use these data as a resource for improvement. And we co-developed a driving question around, how can we collectively use data from an LMS to measure and then better understand students' learning behaviors. And from the very start of the project, it was a collaborative process where we worked with school staff at multiple levels of the organization, from leadership down to classroom teachers, using multiple modes of joint work. And this is a turn of phrase from Bill Penuel and colleagues, which is highlighting that the work of research is often the most fun, and it's often done by knowers as opposed to the doers in our education system. Teachers get to participate in the research as subjects as opposed to those engaging in it. So we tried to think about ways of bringing folks at multiple levels of the CMO into the process of working with these data. So we did joint exploratory data analysis. They participated in operationalization activities, coding activities, and then joint sense making. And all of this is within a particular design challenge that I think was hinted at in the previous comments and presentations, where the idea of there's the digital tasks, which can generate large quantities of data, often produce what can be best described as equivocal data, meaning that there are multiple interpretations as to what led to that data being generated in the first place. It could be our lay theories around self-regulation. It could be some factor from the environment. It could be a totally unrelated set of constructs that actually helps explain why a student did X, Y, or Z. And often when we're working with found data, equivocal data, we don't have access to that data generating mechanism. But one way to reduce that equivocality is to draw on multiple diverse sources of expertise and engage in joint interpretation of those data products. So why do this work in a partnership? As the previous presentation showed, this work can be technically complex, time-consuming, resource-intensive. But we've learned a lot from the folks at the Carnegie Foundation and have built different ways of using these data from digital platforms, whether it's a student information system, a digital learning environment, to support literal improvement projects. We've also used these data to provide more targeted feedback to affect downstream outcomes. And one use and rationale that's developed up over time is using these data to democratize access to what it means to be successful in school. This information is not evenly distributed. And so can we look at patterns in log data and share that broadly with students in schools? And then as folks have argued for several decades now, like, actually the how of students engage in learning is the most important thing. And so we need to be working together as much as possible, avoiding quizzes and tests to actually dig into how do we understand learning strategies, learning behaviors, what Branford and Schwartz in '99 referred to as preparation for future learning. So the setting that we'll dive into in this talk is from a CMO where we had about 3,000 students in grades 6 through 12. All core academic areas, and we looked at 3 years worth of historical data. And what's important and is often ignored is that the actual technology, even though it generates a large amount of data, was central to instruction. And that's a key element in a lot of educational research that often gets ignored, which is actually how central was the technology being used to what the teacher wanted students to learn, et cetera. It's easy to generate data, but if it wasn't core to what was actually to be advanced in the classroom, that data is not just equivocal, it's often just noise. And so the key element of the LMS was this unit, this organizer called a playlist. And this is a familiar organization of content, collection of resources, assessments. And you'll find them in environments much like Guru, Power My Learning, Innovate, etc. So the playlist, very simple construction. Every playlist started with a pre-assessment organized by objectives with a series of resources, whether it could be a URL, a video, a PDF. And then it concluded in a summative assessment by which students need to complete them in order to earn credit for the playlist. Ton of volition was entered into this construction. A student could immediately jump into a summative assessment. A student could immediately jump into a resource. There was no constraints on how a student was to use them. And within the CMO, there's about 10 playlists per course that you need to complete. And we had data about 5 courses per student, which led to approximately 3 million observations per year across those students. So to capture a little bit of that variation, here's a student, three courses, and you can see that in course A, jumped in right away, course B, a little bit of a lag, course C, waited well into the fall semester to start one, course B did 2 back-to-back, et cetera. So there's a high degree of volition both within a playlist, like I was mentioning before, but then between playlists, like when do you start and how often are you completing them in a row. So here's a brief illustration of like what a single playlist, the data would look like over time and how we came to represent it and think about it when we were doing that collaborative work with practitioners in schools. Think of a traditional sort of event table with timestamps for student event and student event and the timestamp, and then organize it in a meaningful unit like day of the school year, and then stack those events sequentially based on when they took place within a given day. So here we have a resource that a student used to launch the playlist. Then the next day, day 17, used a resource and then tried to attempt a pre-assessment and then failed it. Following that, went resource, took some time off, attempted a pre-assessment, passed it, moved to the summative, failed. Now, this is a very simple example. They often are much noisier and much more complicated, but this is the kind of information that we're trying to use to make claims related to the strategies that students were evidencing as they were navigating this playlist into a construct that we eventually referred to as effective playlist navigation. So a central element of the partnership was co-development all the way throughout. And so we co-developed our guiding questions, and we had 3 development questions and then a validity question that got broken out into several analyses. But we were interested, like, what are effective learning behaviors from the perspective of teachers and leaders? What is the relationship between those behaviors and proximal learning outcomes, performances on those summative assessments at the end of a playlist? And then can individual behaviors be turned into a meaningful composite score? And here we're very much concerned with measurement error. So we can have a whole bunch of operationalized features, but if they don't cohere in some way, shape, or form, if there isn't a signal to the noise, we could be promoting inappropriate behaviors to students. We could be supporting wrong-headed inferences for downstream claims related to student learning outcomes, et cetera. And while this was in a partnership and the aims were, very focused on what was taking place within the CMO, we were still trying to carry with us good measurement principles. Again, in this idea that if you're making a decision based off noise as opposed to signal, it can be as negative as not having data at all. And then specifically diving into some validity tests to increase our confidence that that composite score was something that was measuring what we intended it to. So the developed measures, I have a couple of slides and they're organized around some insights from teachers that we wanted to share with you, the links between some behaviors and learning outcomes, and then how we turn those behaviors into a single score. So some insights from teachers and leaders, and I won't read all of them, I'll just hit a few here. These were things that bubbled up as we did focus groups with teachers, and then a core group of folks worked with us throughout the partnership. And they were, based on their experience watching kids complete the LMS, work in the LMS, complete playlists, they wanted to see students passing a pre-assessment before taking a summative assessment. Fairly commonsensical example. Avoid repeated summative assessments. So we generated dozens, if not close to 50 of these different ideas that we then tried to correlate with the proximal outcome. Well, first we tried to operationalize it. Can we take this idea that came up in a discussion, turn it into something that a machine would understand, and then can we take that machine representation and correlate it with a learning outcome? And we also used examples from research. So we did deep dives into some different learning strategies, folks who focus in on self-regulated learning, both in the self-report side, but then also in the learning analytics space with some behavioral data, wheel spinning, productive persistence, and then really took quite a few lessons from the measurement world, looking at Schwartz's work around choice-based assessments, and then of course, Ms. Levy thinking about performance assessment and how evidence-centered design can help us build better construct validity arguments. And here's a super dense slide of just 10 of the operationalizations that sort of survive this process of brainstorming with practitioners. Can we turn it into something a machine can understand? And then is there enough signal that we can find a parameter estimate using a couple of different regression techniques? And the one we stumbled on and used frequently to support these parameter estimates here were some cross-classified mixed effects models where playlist observations were nested within students, were nested within courses, et cetera, to try and have as conservative a set of standard errors as possible around these different operationalizations. So here we're not necessarily focused on prediction per se, we're really doing some inferential work. Does this behavior, as it's operationalized, have some signal related to a student learning outcome? And here, these are the percentage points on that summative assessment that ended a playlist. And I highlighted 4 of them here because these are the 4 that ended up hanging together in a factor analysis that I'll talk about here in a second. And going back to that visualization I showed a second ago of like the events within a playlist, here's how we would, put this kind of visualization up in front of folks to help make sense of these complicated statistical models and say, well, here's the pattern that we're talking about previously. There were 12 events. The first summative assessment was attempted in the 9th attempt, or so therefore there 67% of his or her events occurred before the first summative assessment attempt. Therefore, a person would get credit for this positive learning strategy or behavior. So like I said, we were really interested in carrying with us good measurement principles, even though our claims were much more humble. We're not trying to define self-regulated learning or effective learning strategies for all time zones, for all students, but really within this partnership, but still keeping those rigorous approaches with us. We developed a composite score, in the interest of reducing some irrelevant variance, and these 4 behaviors popped for us using both exploratory and then a confirmatory factor analysis. And because they're 1s and 0s, we used a tetrachoric structure or factor analysis approach. And then moved into our construct validity test. So we were rapidly generating these things, creating scores. And then once we had these 4 things come together and we had this definition, we wanted to see, will this hold up? Can we put this score into harm's way? And so the first thing we did was we had teachers code those playlists like this that I showed before. And we said that the basic prompt was on a scale of 1 to 4, is this effective playlist navigation? And so we asked 15 teachers to do that. And across those teachers, we gave them 6 teachers, I'm sorry, and we gave them 15 common playlists so that we could assess the iterator reliability of our coding, and then to maximize the amount of images that we could get the number of playlists, we had each code 35 unique ones. And in the end, we got a decent ICC, which is the way that we ended up understanding reliability in this context, given the multiple rater situation that we had. And then we were able to correlate the teacher score with our composite score to a degree of 0.58. So we had decent evidence that we were on the right track with this quantification of effective playlist navigation with teachers' scoring of effective playlist navigation. So that was some decent convergent validity. And then in our predictive validity related to the student outcome, we followed some research of Val Schutt and others who had looked at some of the behaviors that her research group had come up with around controlling for incoming, and I think in her case it was physics ability or incoming STEM knowledge, the behavior, and then a focal outcome, and the interaction between the two. And so here we had our composite score, which was significant and positively related to our dependent variable of the summative assessment score. And then we used the students' map test from an NWA map test from the fall and interacted that with their composite score. And we found that indeed, the composite score made up for if you had low MAP, and low MAP made up for if you were not using some of these learning strategies that we had quantified through the score. And so through these different tests, we started to really have some sound evidence that we were measuring that which we intended to measure. And so in summary, it's our big takeaway was that it was really possible to use event data from digital learning environments to measure learning behaviors in a rigorous and interpretable way, much like the platforms that we're talking about before, but in the context of a research practice partnership. And here are, just to reiterate the general approach, was really just getting to understand the setting and the data, what was going on, collaborative exploratory analysis, the idea of joint work, and then not leaving behind the importance of composite scores and formal reliability tests as we were, and validity tests as we were working with the log data. And my colleagues and I at the Carnegie Foundation had tried a similar approach in our efforts with community colleges to demonstrate again that you can do this work collaboratively on a small scale to still generate solid evidence using log data. And I just want to make a quick acknowledgement to Julie Neisler and Howard Everson, who collaborated on the paper version of this paper, or of this talk. And their information is there. And with that, I want to say thank you.
Excellent. For those of you who don't know me, my name is David Porcaro. I am the Director of Learning Engineering at the John Zuckerberg Initiative, and I'm really excited to be discussing in this panel as we all work through a variety of ways to better understand learning through the use of students' digital learning resources. As you've seen, log data is an important tool in a learning scientist toolkit, and there are many others. And what I really liked about this presentation was the connection to other tools within the evaluation measurement toolkit. There were a couple of key ideas that I thought were worth pulling out that I saw in common across all these presentations. One is a strong emphasis on not what works, but what works for whom in what context. With Khan Academy, this was clear in the way they sliced and presented the data. They understood behavioral differences as well as the usage dosages. For Duolingo, this came as they engineered the features that helped them to better understand the behaviors that tie to the learning outcomes with their students. And for Digital Promise, it came through understanding how to categorize and quantify the different student actions that are most predictive of learning success, done in a particular context with an academic partner. As we think across the ecosystems, we'll need clearer ways to connect learning across different learning systems. How can the features of Duolingo correlate with the LMS playlist patterns of Digital Promise's CMO? How might the best practices of Khan Academy identified correlate with the kind of good self-directed learning strategies that Digital Promise is discovering? Shared understanding of constructs and theories of learning, along with translatable metadata, definitions and ontologies, context variables, learning constructs, and learning outcomes will be needed. While some people have begun that work, for instance, Jefferson Education Exchange, Impact Genome, Learn Platform, to just name 3, the ability to connect our learnings across data sets will bring new insights to learning. I think you've heard everyone talk about how there's only so much they could see through their window, and when they opened the window to a partner, they were able to understand so much more about the learning experience. Perhaps we need something like the CEDAR Metadata Center, which tracks and connects 120,829 metadata in biomedical science. What would a system of learning systems, a true industry-wide learning science infrastructure look like, with strong gateways between data providers? In all of these stories, there was an amazing amount of insight we could get by exploring usage patterns in the products. But some of the most amazing insights happened when the partnerships between data structures were made. When the micro-level insights of learning interaction were paired with macro-level insights from school information systems or external formative assessments or state data. What technical, procedural, and cultural developments do we need to continue in the field to expand our ability to connect the 3? What could we learn about student self-regulation and persistence if usage from Duolingo and Khan Academy digital resources were captured in the playlists Digital Promise's academic partner. Second common theme is the process of learning engineering. While it looks a little bit different for the three organizations, there's an understanding that many tools can be used to answer questions of product design. For Khan Academy, they spelled out a clear strategy level theory of change that explains their product's key value proposition. They discuss ways they work to collect data against those learning goals, and most especially progress on external assessment. Hidden in their data is a lower level theory of change, one that hypothesizes that there are discrete actions students should take, but they've managed to demonstrate through a large correlational study how these connect. For Duolingo, their understanding of how students' behaviors contributed to learning took them to explore inexpensive and fast data collection, including frequent A/B testing and triangulation with a portfolio of approaches, including qualitative user experience research. For Digital Promise, the journey of learning engineering was community-driven and deeply participatory, with their academic partner along every step of defining the hypothesized learning journey, creating measures and analyzing the data, and testing those micro-level hypotheses with these new tools. As we do this work, may I suggest we're taking a page from Will Sandoval's conjecture maps. All of what we're doing, in essence, is creating and testing hypotheses. But these hypotheses or conjectures exist at different levels. Business and strategic level goals around user value, target markets, and large theories of change. Intermediate learning science level goals around developing student direction, math learning progressions, communicative skills development, etc. And user level goals about delightful user experiences that fit within users' intentions and workflows. And technical and engineering hypotheses about functionality and stability. Each of these levels has its own conjectures, that certain conditions plus certain interventions lead to certain actions, and that's the design conjecture. Or did the design lead to the kind of behaviors that we anticipated? And then did those actions lead to the outcomes we anticipated, the theoretical conjecture? As we build these conjectures, connecting the evidence we have from usage patterns, user observations, and third-party research, we can quickly identify those riskiest assumptions that we don't have good evidence for. Is this the best practice, or this other best practice the one that we should be promoting? And there we conduct various rapid tests of finding the data in inobtrusive ways, using or modifying existing data collection efforts, triangulating it with user observation and surveys, etc. We don't stop there. With the formative data we have, the more formative data we have, the more certain and less equivocal we become with our conjectures, until we're ready to start comparison testing. How does our design compare with another intervention or no intervention at all in experimental and quasi-experimental tasks? But let me caution that we don't focus on, does that product work in these experiments, but rather, does it work in this setting with these users to meet these goals? And these are the goals of the learners, not our own. So lastly, as we engage in the important and challenging work of measuring and improving learning outcomes, which will take all the best efforts of everyone here and so many others, let me leave us with one thought to continue to push our thinking. Our work is not atheoretical or neutral. Any design is an externalization of the concepts, worldviews, and goals of the people who made it. As we measure the efficacy of our products and the impact on learning outcomes, let us ask ourselves a few questions. What are our intentions? What goals do we bias in the metrics we highlight? How does our worldview shape our interpretation? Who is not part of the decision-making process? And how might we be unintentionally furthering systematic oppression, racism, classism, ableism, or other inequities through what we count as evidence and what behaviors we believe are best? Now I will turn it to some questions. I'm going to open up to the panel and just see first if you have any reactions or thoughts based off my comments, and then we'll open it to the questions that were posted in the chat, and then see if other people have questions after that. So first, any reactions to my comments or discussion?
I can say something really quickly to that. I think those are really great points. I really appreciate your you thinking about this in terms of different groups of people are expecting different things from our product. This is something that at Duolingo we really think about a lot, because, for example, someone learning an English speaker, native English speaker learning French is very different from someone learning English from Spanish, say. You know, the needs of those users are very different, and we see that in the data. And so that's something that we've been working really carefully with. And another thing that you mentioned was this idea of sort of external exchanges and ways of sharing information across different products or frameworks. One thing that I think was revolutionary for us was aligning our content with what's called the CEFR, the Common European Framework Reference for Language. I think I got that right. Oof, it's a tricky one. And that really just allowed us to start thinking about our product in a much broader collection of different approaches to learning a language. So completely agree with the 2 points that you brought up, David.
Yeah, I do as well. And I just wanted to add the and it was Joseph's last comment there that triggered the also another level of standards that needs to exist. And it might be more informal. It might be something that develops hopefully more quickly than I think some emergent process has led us to, which is like the real distinctions across content areas. And so the CEFR is like really interesting. And some domains have really thought about how to categorize their content, and other domains have done less so, or in a way that is much more complex to work with. And so that you can tag a similar activity with a similar piece of content is actually excruciatingly difficult, even with some of these content providers who tap into test providers who have large research and development funds to do this. It still is super complicated intellectual work. It's not a resources problem. And then the other is some kind of standard around the instructional models. Like a Duolingo experience is vastly different than an LMS experience, which is vastly different than a Khan Academy experience. And so like, even if we do have some set of standards that tag an event, and that event is potentially shareable, it might not be usable. And that is a huge difference given the true diversity that exists across what we call learning and assessment. And when we conflate the two, and then when we try and jump grades, like it becomes very complicated very quickly. And again, I don't know if it's a technical problem, and I don't know if it's a resource problem. It's just some really hard intellectual terrain that needs to be mapped to support this kind of work. Excellent.
I believe some of you were answering some of the questions as they were coming up in the discussion. I wanted to make sure, for instance, Duolingo, you had a chance to respond to some of the questions that were coming in, but if you want to spend a couple more minutes expanding on any of those questions, or if you want to take it just a second or two to respond to any of the in-chat comments.
I'm afraid I lost some of the chat log due to technical issues. Is there anything specific, David, that you think?
Yeah, so the questions, let me pull them up. You talked about, someone asked about determining how to decay the effect of the earlier lesson interaction versus later interactions. In the review challenge, do users see an item they've seen before or an item that they may or may not have seen? I think you responded to that. And the pre-post gains are often unreliable depending on the design of the pre-post measure. May be better to use a pre as a covariate and statistical models.
Yeah, I mean,
and then there were a lot of questions about features and how what those features were, and then depending on the simple aggregate level features you mentioned, very successful to make the prediction. How successful is it according to the prediction accuracy? What is the prediction accuracy rate? How about the reliability of the prediction, and what are the statistical models used in the prediction?
Yeah, that's great. So I'll talk a little bit about the features and the models that we build, and what we mean by success, because I think success for us might not necessarily be the same as it may be in an academic context. So for us, primarily, our idea of success is that we have something that we can provide to a product team and tell them, hey, this is something that we think we should improve and work on to make the product better. And so our goal isn't necessarily to build models that are the most predictive, have the highest accuracy rates, but instead are easily interpretable. So we tend to really, so far, we've been really reliant on very simple models based on logistic regression, you know, just very, very simple stuff like that with relatively straightforward features, because they allow us to provide a story to the product teams, which aren't necessarily as technically adept at understanding, you know, the science behind it, and we can then move forward with that. Xiangying, do you have anything else to add to that?
No, I think, yeah, you answered the question. Some of these features, for example, leveling up is really, you know, to what level they actually work through the content is a very significant predictor to a lot of this gain when we measure learning. And also sometimes learners test out, we allow them to test out of things. This often goes against the amount of things they can learn from our courses. So that's something I want to specify.
Excellent. With Khan Academy, here are the questions that came up in the chat. Cody, sorry if I missed this. What numbers and sampling features are used in these indicators, i.e. all students or segmented by specific type of product? Also, how are these incorporated into analyses examining outcomes? And is Khan Academy using any type of badging or other UI devices to manage engagement with the platform and or incentivize review of material at optimal intervals to improve retention? I think you answered that question in the chat. Do you want to expand on any of those or other questions that came up?
Yeah, to the first one, the data visualizations that we showed here, these are not based on all students. These are specific subsets that were part of research practice partnerships. So by no means is that like representative of the entire product suite or set of users. To the point around how are they incorporated into analyses, it kind of depends on the goal, but I guess there are kind of two big threads. So one is if we imagine that a study has a particular implementation model in mind, that we want students to use a particular product for a particular dosage over a particular period of time, that's all well and good. We can go and pull those data and see, like, did a student do that or not? But we might also want to know, like, what other things did they do on the platform that might be contributing to their math learning or the ELA learning, to be able to use those as covariates in the model. So having that kind of like panoramic view of what is everything that you did outside of the things that maybe were recommended for the implementation model is useful, one kind of like diagnostically, but also from like a covariate adjustment perspective. But then there's another lens that I think kind of taps into things that Andy was talking about of sometimes these are operationalized in very similar ways and kind of become the predictors of interest in regression models. So we can say, you know, students who did action sequence ABC or who did, you know, this combination, like what were their outcomes relative to another group. So kind of using those as like key elements of the inference space in their own right.
Awesome. For digital promise, Andrew, are you able to speak at all to the effect of data interoperability and making it possible to access the data from the LMS and related products? And just out of curiosity, why use factor analysis for scoring and not MERT or bifactor models?
So starting with the latter question, I definitely played around with them. But the data that we were working with, as you could kind of see as we bubbled up from operationalizations to something that could be coded 1 or 0, it was pretty noisy. And I think though a MERT model is really an effective tool in a well-defined, if you have a well-defined cognitive model with test items, or even in a self-report questionnaire space where these are very highly honed items and so forth. We just weren't at that level of specificity. There wasn't that level of iteration that went into it. And so those models can wildly overfit to noisy data. And we had definitely noisy data because it was going from, hey, wouldn't it be great if we thought about kids doing this to predict their long-term outcomes or their short-term outcomes. And so in some ways, the oldest school, the much more friendly, the most general sort of least squares approaches are still the best for these kinds of data. I think like Joseph mentioned that with the Duolingo, some of their models too, where some of the fancier stuff just was kind of too noisy for the noisy data that we already have. And so 2 wrongs definitely didn't make a right in that case. And then in the LMS, sort of the standard question, it is something that in Digital Promise we have wrestled with are advocates for many different kinds of standards, want to see the world do it, but also recognize the true difficulty and complexity in it. And in our case, to make the data usable, what we did was had to partner with folks who understood, it's a silly phrase, but it still is like just so germane to all of this work, the data generating mechanism, which is the kids' use of the system. And if we didn't have folks who are watching people do it on a day-to-day basis, or had answered students' questions, or really had those the felt pain points from the front line, we wouldn't have been able to use it in as an effective way. So we kind of short-circuited the standards in some respects by going straight to the front lines, working with folks to help us make sense of the data, to make them usable. We could have shared it, and the data were shared quite easily because this was a dyadic thing between the two organizations. And some of the interoperability stuff can make flying data from system to system much easier, but it still might not answer that usability question, which is just something that like I keep coming back to over and over again, like a broken record, because it was just so painful across not just this partnership, but others in the past. Like, how do you actually generate some sort of information out of all the clicks? It's very complicated.
Excellent. There was a pretty lively discussion that was generated in the chat, if you got a chance to see it, around data privacy, who owns the data, sharing data between the school districts and content providers, vendors, LMSs. And I'm curious, you know, in all of your work, especially for you, Andy, you were working directly with a charter management organization. With Duolingo and Khan, I think your access to schools isn't as direct, but you're still oftentimes maybe doing projects directly with schools and collecting larger system data. What have been the challenges? What have been some of the things that you've seen that are working? What are some of the things that we just as a field need to really watch out for? Any thoughts about that discussion around collecting and sharing student data?
Yeah, so on the Khan Academy side, we do have a few different partnerships. I kind of alluded to those in some of our slides that enable a lot of the research that we're able to do. So Khan Academy alone, we don't collect any information on our users' demographics. We don't ask a child any details about them. Some teachers might select the name of their school if they opt into, so we might have some rough proxies on a subset of our data, but by and large, we don't have any sort of demographic insights on our users, nor do we have any sort of external measure of achievement. Those all come through external partnerships. So for example, we have a partnership with NWEA. We have a product with them where MAP scores are used to create a personalized plan on Khan Academy. And through that partnership, we have access to a lot of data at scale, assuming that the school district signs off on that and provides their consent for us to use that data for research purposes. Our partnership with College Board, a somewhat similar situation, that we're able to access student achievement and demographic data if the student provides consent. So we have a consenting mechanism on platform for the older students to be able to consent for that. But it's very hard to get these agreements into place. They take at least a year, if not longer, to get a data sharing agreement in place. And we've done some data sharing agreements with some school districts, not many, just a couple. One of our papers was with Long Beach Unified School District in California, and that too took, you know, a solid part of a year to get the data sharing agreement in place, and where we share identified data with the school district, and then the school district matches and merges in demographic and test scores, and then de-identifies the data and shares it back with us, so that Khan Academy is only working with de-identified data. But to get even something like that in place with the school district requires a lot on both ends of the partnership. On the Khan Academy side, to extract the data and get it into a usable format for the district, and then on the district side, to be able to then take that data and do the de-identification process. So it's a lot of work on both ends to be able to do that. And we just need to be very careful every step along the way, making sure that the highest standards possible are met for student data privacy.
Go ahead.
It's all right. We can move on. I was just Duolingo has similar issues, but we can move on if you have other questions.
No, I'd love to hear what insights you've gained from your process.
So I mean, so Duolingo is relatively lucky in this respect. So number one, we do not partner directly with schools, or historically have not. We support COPPA, so COPPA. So we are able to separate the data of people under the age of 13 and above. So that allows us to ensure that we're not using any data collected about children. When we run any kind of user studies, we automatically prohibit anyone under the age of 18. And if you're interested in seeing the kind of data that Duolingo collects, we support GDPR, which means that you can dump all of the data that we have about you to see the kind of stuff we're collecting. You know, luckily for us, the kind of data that we collect about our users isn't that particularly interesting to most people, you know, so we're relatively lucky in that respect.
I'm tempted to ask the question David Furlow asks, but I might get some of you in trouble to give your opinion about the idea of compensating schools and students for the use of their data, especially if you're a commercial product who's benefiting financially from the use of someone else's data. If anyone wants to respond to that question, I'll throw out the pitch.
I mean, I can. Oh no, please, Cody, you go. Sorry.
I was just. I think it's an excellent question, and to me, part of what it was resonating with is, David, back to you're kind of alluding to this like paradigm shift of, you know, what would it take to kind of you know, if we had large scale systems that like allow greater interoperability across, you know, different stakeholders, and this seems to be, I don't know how well formed my opinions are on it, but I do think that we're at a juncture in time where I think the bottlenecks that I think across the presentations that we've had here, that like there are these kind of common things we bump up against that you articulated in your synthesis around, you know, what are the, you know, each project is limited to their own data, and like how do we get the data that's you know, that's critical but not on our platform, that's needed for these types of insights. And then this question from David and others is kind of getting into you know, who are the people who are benefiting from data, and who are the people who are then the providers of data, but are kind of in some sense being left out of the circle in ways that are marginalizing. And so I guess all to say, I think they're going forward, it seems like the current paradigm is useful in some ways, but is also kind of fundamentally broken in some ways. And I'm curious to hear other people what they think about like a large scale kind of system reform, and like what that would look like in terms of a paradigm shift.
David, this is Howard.
Yes, do you have a question?
Yeah, well, just a comment on this. I mean, so this is an issue, this is a long-standing issue in educational research and in program evaluation research. And in some of the projects I've been involved with over the years, we have paid school districts, because one of the things to keep in mind is school districts are not data production outfits. They typically don't have, I mean, if you actually talk to some of the staff, many of them can barely use an Excel spreadsheet. So you've got real, honest to God limitations at the site specific issues, the schools, the districts themselves. I mean, in Andy's work, he benefited tremendously because there was a learning management system in place. Most schools, most districts, especially publicly funded districts, simply don't have data organization and data generation capabilities. Or if they do, they're really largely in the service of the school district and not in the service of the myriad vendors that they work with. So it's a very, very large problem. And unfortunately, we don't fund the public schools. I've had funding from MacArthur and others that allowed me to put people in schools to say, we'll give you X thousands of dollars for a year or two, so you have a data management person. But that, you know, that doesn't work all that well either sometimes. So, but it is a very, very large problem.
Thank you. It sounds like we need a panel on that next year.
Yeah, maybe, maybe, yeah. Good idea.
Okay, I'm going to close with one last question for each group. If we can just round robin, we'll go in the order that we presented. So Duolingo, then Khan, then Digital Promise. You're at different stages of maturity, or working with different organizations at different stages of maturity. What advice would you give to someone who's getting started, a small EdTech organization or a district who's trying to look into the use of and collecting and analyzing trace data?
Xiangying, do you have anything to say? Well, I think.
I think for each product, they probably have their own internal assessment, which they can do. So it can be more context dependent for themselves to figure out and help understand what is working, what is probably not working and can be improved. So it's more to inform their product development and revision in some sense. So from inside, I would say that's where they start.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. I think the only thing that I would add is that I think the most important thing is thinking about the data that you're collecting. Is this data actually usable? How can you make sure that the data you're collecting is usable? So for example, one of the really big door openers for us was being like, look, we need to change this product. We need to change how we teach people so that we can measure it. And I think that's really important when you're beginning a project like this, is thinking about, well, am I collecting enough data to make interesting statements? If not, how can I make small adjustments to how the product works or the whatever system you're using so that you can make interesting statements?
Yeah, and to piggyback on what Joseph just said there, to the extent that a nascent organization can start building learning engineering into their products from the start, you'll be way better off further down the line, because it is very difficult to re-instrument all of your systems after the fact to then take into account, okay, how do we actually measure, we built this great learning product, how do we actually measure learning? If you didn't do all of that work in the beginning, it becomes just drastically more difficult to re-instrument your entire system. So that would be my advice to starting organization.
And I guess we get 1 minute left for Andy. Your final thoughts. Close this up.
Yeah, I think if I were to channel some folks who are outside of schools or outside of a vendor, it is to think about, if you're a researcher, for example, what's the value that you're providing to the school, which is a slightly different way of orienting your work than what's a research question that I can get answered for the field. It's like, what in my work with you, in the service of that question, can I actually add value-wise for what's happening in your classrooms?
Excellent. Join me in thanking everyone for an excellent discussion today and for your comments and questions. And it looks like there's a survey. If you'll take that as you close out before you leave the Zoom, click on that link.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for facilitating, David.
Thank you.